Ever get that feel, like that nagging suspicion that someone's decision wasn't entirely fair? Like maybe you didn't get that job or that loan for reasons beyond your control. Well, today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that's increasingly impacting all our lives: algorithms. And whether you realize it or not, they're playing a role in those very scenarios. We've got some fascinating research to unpack, including this paper with a really thought provoking title: Discrimination in the Age of Algorithms. Don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. What's really interesting is that it suggests algorithms might actually make it easier to identify and tackle discrimination, especially compared to the complexities of human judgment. But before we get into that, we need to start with a bit of a brain teaser. How can we even be sure discrimination is happening in the first place?
That's a great question, and it's way more complicated than you might think. You see, we often talk about proving discrimination. But even when we suspect it, getting to the bottom of why someone made a decision is incredibly difficult. It's like trying to solve a mystery with only half the clues.
It's true. I mean, people aren't exactly lining up to announce their biases, are they?
Exactly. And what makes it even trickier is that many of our biases operate on an unconscious level. Psychologists call this implicit bias.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, it's this hidden part of our minds where stereotypes and attitudes we might not even personally agree with,
Mm-hmm.
but they can still influence our actions.
So even if you think you're being completely fair and impartial, these implicit biases can sneak in and affect your decisions without you even realizing it.
Precisely. It's like a hidden program running in the background, shaping our perceptions and choices. And because it's so unconscious, it's incredibly hard to prove discriminatory intent. The research we're diving into highlights this with some really interesting examples. Have you ever heard of the Robbers Cave experiment?
I haven't. Tell me more.
Well, researchers took a group of boys, all very similar in background, and randomly divided them into two groups.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, just by having them compete against each other, these boys developed strong prejudices against the other group.
Wow, just from being on different teams? You're kidding.
Nope. And there were no actual differences between the groups. This experiment just goes to show how easily those us versus them biases can take root.
It really makes you wonder, right? How often do we make snap judgments without even realizing it? And how often are those judgments influenced by factors we're not even aware of?
And it gets even more compelling. The paper also discusses studies on job applications. Researchers sent out identical resumes, only changing the names to imply different racial backgrounds. What do you think happened?
I'm guessing those with names more commonly associated with certain backgrounds got more callbacks, even if the qualifications were identical.
You got it. It's a stark reminder that even when people have the best intentions, these subtle cues can activate hidden biases and lead to unequal outcomes.
It's almost like these subconscious associations can throw off the balance of fairness without anyone intentionally trying to discriminate.
And that's exactly the point. With human decision-making, it's like trying to untangle a giant knot of unconscious biases, societal influences, and individual experiences. So if our own brains are this complex and hard to decipher, where do we even begin to address these issues? That's where algorithms come in, but not as the quick fix you might assume.
Okay, so we've established our brains are basically walking, talking bias factories, often without us even realizing it. It makes you wonder, is there a better way to make decisions? A way to cut through all that human messiness? That's where algorithms come in, right?
Well, not so fast. It's easy to think of algorithms as these perfectly objective forces, like they're somehow above all the biases we humans struggle with. But the truth is, they're not the magic solution you might think.
Really? I guess that makes sense. They are created by humans, after all, right?
Precisely. You've got to remember, algorithms are just tools. And like any tool, they can be used for good or bad, fairly or unfairly. It all depends on how they're built and the data they're trained on. Think of an algorithm like a new employee. We'll call her, how about Alice?
Okay, Alice the algorithm, I like it.
So Alice is eager to learn and make good decisions for the company. But she doesn't know anything about the real world yet. That's where the data comes in. The data is like Alice's training manual. It's full of information from the past that's supposed to teach her how to make judgments about the future.
Okay, so the data is essentially shaping Alice's understanding of the world.
Exactly. Now imagine that training manual is filled with examples of people who look a certain way or come from a certain background, always getting promoted.
Hmm.
What do you think Alice will learn from that?
She'll start to think that those characteristics are important for success, even if they're not.
Precisely. And here's the kicker, even if we tell Alice, hey, don't consider someone's background. If the data keeps showing that people from a certain background are always the ones getting ahead, Alice might still unintentionally perpetuate that pattern.
That's a scary thought. So even if an algorithm isn't specifically programmed to discriminate, it can still pick up on those hidden patterns in the data and end up making biased decisions.
Unfortunately, yes. The data we feed these algorithms reflects all of society's complexities,
Mhm.
including the good, the bad, and the downright ugly. And if we're not careful, those biases can get baked into systems that have a huge impact on people's lives.
Okay, so algorithms aren't inherently neutral. They're just really good at learning from whatever we teach them, even if we're unintentionally teaching them the wrong things. That leaves me wondering, though, is there any way to use algorithms to actually help us address these issues? Or are we just stuck with a digital version of the same old problems? So it sounds like algorithms can be a bit of a double-edged sword. They can inherit our biases, but maybe they can also help us uncover and address them. Is there a way to make these digital minds work for fairness instead of against it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where this research takes a really fascinating turn. It argues that algorithms, if designed thoughtfully and with the right safeguards in place, might actually be better at detecting and mitigating discrimination than we are.
Hold on, really. You're saying algorithms, the things we just established, can learn to be biased, might actually be the key to solving bias.
It seems counterintuitive, right? But here's the key difference. Algorithms are designed step by step. We can trace every decision they make back to the data they learned from, like retracing your steps to find a lost key. With the human mind, it's a whole different story. Our thought processes are this messy mix of conscious and unconscious influences, making it really hard to pinpoint the root cause of a biased decision.
So it's like trying to decipher a secret code versus having the actual decoder ring in your hand.
Exactly. When it comes to algorithms, we can ask specific questions like, what's the main goal of this algorithm? Is it trying to predict job success, the likelihood of someone repaying a loan, or something else? Then we can dig deeper and ask, okay, what data points is it using to make those predictions? Is it relying on factors that have historically been used to discriminate, even if those categories aren't explicitly part of the algorithm's code?
And here's where things get really mind-bending. The research suggests that, in some cases, allowing an algorithm to see factors like race or gender might actually help it make fairer decisions. How does that even work?
Think of it this way. Let's say an algorithm is evaluating loan applications, but it's not allowed to consider race. It might see that people with a certain credit score are less likely to repay their loans. But what it doesn't see is that due to systemic biases, people from certain backgrounds might have lower credit scores, even if they're actually very responsible borrowers.
So the algorithm is just blindly following the patterns in the data without understanding the underlying reasons for those patterns.
Exactly. But if the algorithm is allowed to see race and understand how historical inequalities might have influenced things like credit scores, it can actually learn to adjust for those disparities and make more equitable decisions.
Wow, that's incredibly powerful, but also a bit daunting, right? It feels like we're walking a tightrope between using this knowledge for good and potentially amplifying existing biases if we're not careful.
You're absolutely right. This isn't about simply fixing algorithms. It's about demanding transparency from the people and institutions using them. We need to be asking tough questions about how these algorithms are built, what data they're using, and what steps are being taken to ensure fairness.
It's like we've been handed this incredibly powerful tool, but with great power comes great responsibility, right? We can't just assume algorithms are inherently good or bad. We need to be informed, engaged, and ready to hold those in power accountable.
Exactly. It's up to all of us to learn more about these systems, ask critical questions, and advocate for a future where algorithms are used to create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
This has been an incredible deep dive, and a real reminder that the world of algorithms is far more complex than we often realize. A huge thanks to you for breaking it all down so clearly.
It was my pleasure. Always happy to geek out about algorithms and their impact on society.
And to all our listeners, this is just the beginning of the conversation. We've included links to the research we discussed along with some other fascinating resources in the show notes. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future, one algorithm at a time. Until next time, happy diving.